So everybody happy to be here at the home of the champions of Europe? Is that a yes? Any Man City fans in the audience? Yeah, it was great I'm a Liverpool fan. It was great coming through the gate this morning and meeting the guy in the gate. And I said to him, where am I going? He said, see the Colin Bell stand over there. I said, I can't see it. He said, there's a sign above it. It says, champions again. And I went, I can't see that. I'm blocking that bit out. And he said, how do you think I feel as a Man U fan? So we had a Man U fan on the gate. And I said, it could be worse. We could both be Chelsea fans, right? So that's for Juan and Sam in the audience. So listen, thanks very much for having us today. Yes, we are sponsors of Man City. They've done a great job, fantastic team to beat for the next few years. But it's always great to be in a location like this and experience some of the great history of Man City. Just while Francis was talking, I thought of something that we did a few years ago in Italy during the pandemic. Actually, we got the Williams CTO in Italy to present to some partners, and he got up on stage. We were talking, and I knew he was a runner, and I said to him, "Give us 20 minutes, and we'll do a hack on you and see what we can do in the next 20 minutes." And 20 minutes later, I obviously knew his name. We found out that we actually presented him an email that we had drafted from one of his best friends, who we didn't know, but we knew he was a best friend. Basically saying there's an offer on. We didn't use JD Sports, Francis, wherever you are. We used some other sports. I think it was sportshoes.com, and we said there's an offer on your favorite running shoes. In that 20 minutes when he was on stage, we basically found out that he was running with the same group of people every week because we had access to his Strava. His Strava was public. We found out what pair of shoes he was wearing, and we knew that he ran at 9:15 or something like that on a Saturday morning. Within minutes, we then figured out that he ran with this one person all the time, which we didn't know was his best friend, but obviously a good friend. And then we sent him an email saying, look at this offer or click on this link. So it's quite easy to do. And it just, when Francis was telling me about that earlier on, or was talking about that earlier on, it just kind of reminded me of that. So it's quite easy to do. I've got the exciting subject of IT disaster recovery. I do want to talk a little bit about Cobweb. They're great to work with. They're an absolutely great partner of ours. We know Cobweb for many, many years. Fantastic partnering company. They really get partnership. Fantastic staff. Apart from Juan Lyle, he's rubbish, by the way, so just stay away from him and you'll be okay. So, Acronis, we've a heritage in disaster recovery. Going back 2003, we started some 20 years ago this year. Our mission statement, I'm going to start with the Microsoft mission statement, actually. When Microsoft was incorporated in 1984, June 1984, Bill Gates famously said that he wanted to have a PC on every desk. We all know that quote, don't we? What he didn't say was by Microsoft, which is really important. And that's kind of the heritage of Microsoft. The heritage of Acronis is slightly similar in that we want to protect all data systems and applications or workloads, but we don't say by Acronis. I think Francis mentioned it earlier, Claire certainly mentioned it as well, that vendors are getting better at actually relying on other vendors to support them in their mission statement. We have a platform. We also sell solutions, but we have a platform that delivers best-in-breed technology, not only our own technology, but other people's technology, SentinelOne, CrowdStrike. We're even talking to Mimecast at the moment about potentially doing an integration there as well. So it's important that we provide all those technologies to you so that you get the best protection possible from all these vendors. So that's our mission statement, and we've been, as I said, we've been in disaster recovery for a number of years now, and great heritage. I ran a service provider in Basingstoke called Adam Continuity. We had about, I don't know, 200 clients at one stage. We dealt with the big banks, JP Morgan, Barclays, Royal Bank of Scotland. We provided traditional disaster recovery solutions. But I met a guy called Oscar O'Connor in 2006. He came in as our CTO, and he said, "Come over here, Ronan, and have a look at what I'm doing." And he was backing up his laptop to the cloud, and I said, "Well, what's the cloud? And he said, he started to explain how the technology, I was joking obviously, but he explained how the technology actually worked. And there was a product called Atix 5 at the time. We were completely new to it. We didn't know anything about cloud or backup or data centers or anything like that. We made a lot of mistakes on the way. We looked at a lot of vendors. We looked at a lot of different technology for our clients. And it was a really interesting period. It was a complete transition from the traditional disaster recovery. And traditional DR was a warehouse full of servers, workstations, printers, routers. And we would ship them to a location of the client's choice, a predetermined location. And generally, we would get boxes of tapes on which we'd have to recover. Our engineers would come down and work with the actual the end users and work with them to recover the tapes. And you'd be, some of the tapes didn't recover, some of them didn't catalog correctly. Some of the tapes were missing. We had a horrendous time doing some of the rehearsals. So when cloud technology came along in 2006 for us, and we started to use that, we saw the future. So that's a little bit of my background in developing the kind of cloud solutions in Atom Continuity, and we went into do replication and everything else. But fundamentally, I hope we all know what disaster recovery is. It's ultimately highlighting those critical systems and making sure that those critical systems are recovered as quickly as possible. Okay, so brief history of disaster recovery. Goes back to the 70s, actually, started in the US. A lot of the actual regulatory bodies in the US started to insist, and insurance companies in the US started to insist on disaster recovery. And we saw the emergence of disaster recovery companies, people like ICM, SunGard in the UK, for example, SunGard in the US for that matter as well, and some smaller service providers as well that actually focused on true disaster recovery at the time. Things started to change in the 90s with the Microsoft operating systems becoming more prevalent, and then obviously VMware and other virtualization solutions as well became a little bit more easier to provide automated failover and recovery in the cloud. And since the 2000s, and I mentioned 2006 earlier on, we've seen a vast array of solutions develop over the last number of years. Some good, some not so good, some very affordable and some not so affordable ones as well. Sorry, I'm getting used to this keypad here. So, a couple of pictures from my old days here, but I don't know if you remember those kind of old big vans or big trucks that used to kind of ship out all the equipment, but also you'd have a recovery center in there, so you might have 10 seats in the actual truck that would actually house your IT staff, and you'd recover the systems within there. It would have a generator on the back, keep the actual equipment cool. It was really noisy inside because obviously you had a generator strapped to the actual truck. But basically, we've come a long way since those days. I mean, these were some of the way we transported kind of equipment in those days. But very interesting times. But it radically changed very, very quickly, and it's obviously evolved significantly over the last number of years. And in the early days, with the banks in particular, I worked with Barclays on building their data center in Gloucester, and they had huge data centers replicating to each other right across the country and the world, for that matter. Very, 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 very expensive, and a huge amount of man hours put into the actual management of the actual data centers. Hybrid approach came along in the 2000s when we had a little bit more technology. People used the cloud a little bit more and actually started to kind of use recovery centers or recovery locations or colo for that matter as well. And now we've become a little bit more modern in the last couple of years. So who needs DR? Well, again, this is a very basic presentation, but my view is, and you can, depending on who you talk to, every company needs disaster recovery. If you're a small shop down the road in Manchester or a large company in the middle of London, it doesn't matter. You all need disaster recovery. And it's safe to say that the best businesses use disaster recovery or are prepared for a disaster of some sort or another. It's usually a sign that everything else in the business is running really well when you've got a really good disaster recovery plan. I know that I've been working with 300 partners over the many 10, 15 years now, and you see that everything else in that business, once they have a disaster recovery plan, they've considered a lot of other things in their business as well. I was going to, this was touched on a few times already today by Sarah and Francis, but So I won't go into it as much, but you know, I was thinking of a couple of examples for you that I could share. One was the Buncefield disaster in 2005, and how to prepare for the unexpected. Buncefield was December 2005, and it was, for those of you that don't know, it was just outside Luton, and the Buncefield oil refinery went on fire. It actually exploded, but it exploded so much that in Luton's town centre, 2 miles away, all the glass shattered on the high street. The whole high street was shut down. The M1, which was a mile away on the other side, actually cracked, so they actually had to close the M1. The big thing wasn't so much the fire. The fumes were really bad, and they had to evacuate the schools in the area. They had to evacuate the towns and everything else. But ultimately, the actual problem was lack of access to the IT equipment, or lack of access to your location. Ironically, we actually built our disaster recovery center on the Buncefield depot about a year later, actually, when they closed it down. But it was a real massive learning point for a lot of businesses at the time, because the whole of that Bedfordshire area was actually ultimately shut down and didn't have access to their IT equipment, even though their IT equipment was up and running, potentially. The other one, a smaller example, was one in Cardiff Business Park, where there was a recycling centre with a lot of rubbish gathered into a part of the recycling centre. It caught fire. We don't know how it caught fire, but I always remember it. It was always it was close to our recovery centre, and the BBC arrived on site and started to film, and they interviewed people. And I remember it was December the 5th, and it would have been about 2012 or something around that, 2011. And it was December the 5th, and the fire was, because it was old material that was caught fire, it burned very slowly, didn't burn very fast. But they realized then that it had caught hold of some tires, old tires. And I don't know if you've ever tried to put out an old tire on fire. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. But they interviewed somebody on December the 5th, and they said, how's this affecting your business? And he had a small business on the site, and he basically said, yeah, it's okay, we'll be in there tomorrow. And it was January the 5th, BBC were back 1 month later exactly, and he still hadn't got access to the site. So they were kind of simple things that we dealt with on a daily basis, where people had lack of access to their actual IT, which was a huge issue. That business closed down 6 months later. And that's an example of kind of some of the things that can happen. People, again, very basic, but people say backup, cloud backup. It would have been backup in the old days, but now it's cloud backup. Cloud backup is as good as disaster recovery. Well, it isn't, because ultimately, you know, you can have your data, and I know most of you know this already. It's a very simple thing to kind of talk about, but ultimately having your data in a location is one thing, but actually recovering it is something completely different. And having access to infrastructure, having access to the right personnel and the right resources to be able to kind of help you get back up and running as quickly as possible is important. And ultimately, that's where disaster recovery is much more significant than your standard backup. Again, another basic slide, but you know, the differences between backup and disaster recovery, fairly straightforward for most of us, but ultimately backup is about data retention and compliance and making sure that you don't lose data. Ultimately, disaster recovery is something completely different, recovering that data as quickly as possible onto hot storage or pre-prepared hardware that can actually get you back up and running as quickly as possible. RTO and RPO, again, some simple things to go through here, but sorry, I couldn't make this slide any bigger, and I only put it together in the last couple of days, but simply put, you know, your RPO is your recovery point objective, when your data was last available to you and when you can go back to it. And obviously working in a data protection company, we have different ways of actually protecting the data. Using backup, for example, we can recover the backups going back 1 week, 1 day, 15 minutes, right up to 15 minutes ago. And then you've got, the closer you get to the disaster, the more expensive the actual cost of the RPO. So if you want to have instant data or asynchronous or synchronous replicated data, it's going to be much more expensive. Equally, the recovery time, on the opposite side, the closer you are to the disaster, generally the more expensive the actual option is for you. Again, depending on the criticality of your systems, if you want them back quicker, you have to pay a little bit more in general. Regulatory issues are becoming more and more important, and regulatory bodies, the builders trade in the UK, have started to kind of put in disaster recovery requirements for some of the manufacturers that they deal with. We've seen more development in the US with the HIPAA compliance as well. We've obviously got our own FSA and FDA regulations here, for example, that impact us here, and more industry bodies are getting involved to make sure that actually we're all prepared. Evolution of threats. I talked a little bit about some of the disasters that we actually had we experienced in my last business. Generally, natural disasters were. I remember Sarah actually talked about the pandemics, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the natural disasters you don't really think about too often, but they're actually some of the worst ones. 2008, the Thames Valley flood near Newbury, where I live. It was horrendous. You know, businesses were closed down. It was under 3-4 feet of water for several weeks. We probably remember, or maybe you don't, the snow days in 2010 when the country was kind of under snow for 3-4 foot of snow just suddenly fell in a couple of hours. People couldn't get into work. Simple things like that. Not necessarily natural disasters, but had a massive impact on businesses and access to IT. And lack of access to IT for that matter. Pandemics were, the avian flu. I remember Sarah mentioned the H1N1 virus. That was, there was a lot of talk around that one from a disaster recovery point of view. What would we do? And it was very, very new to everybody at the time. How do you cope with the business impact of avian flu, for example? And we were very inexperienced at actually being able to cope with avian flu. We've obviously learned a lot in the last 3 years about pandemics, and the pandemic that we obviously just went through, I think it cost the UK taxpayer about $4 trillion from an IT perspective in the first 3 weeks. So we were nearly $1 trillion a week in debt as a result of the pandemic we just had. That wasn't the cost of vaccines or anything else. That was just pure productivity loss. And that was because we were not prepared to get people up and running and their homes and that quickly, and IT infrastructure and everything else. So equally, not a disaster recovery from an IT point of view, but lack of preparation actually impacted the actual country quite significantly. And then you've got your standard ones, which are your hardware failure, accidental deletion of data, and cyber attacks. And Sam, who used to work down the back, used to work with me, knows I love this slide, and I've been doing this slide for, it seems like 6 years now. I got quite excited when I saw this slide the first time, but anybody want to hazard a guess the first ransomware strain that was discovered, what year would it have been? You can probably tell from the slide. Well, you can probably guess. Have a guess? Anybody? 2000? 1999 was the first strain of ransomware, and it was found on a floppy disk of all things, right? For those of you that don't remember, Sam, I see you at the back there, right? So floppy disk was something we used to use in the old days. It didn't work because obviously it was missing two things. It was missing, well, in 1999 we were at the infancy of the internet, and in 2012 obviously cryptocurrency came along. Now this is this only goes up to 2017 because I did do another one, but it gets ridiculously small. But you get the idea. The idea is that ultimately the strains are developing all the time. As a provider of data protection services, we're very, very conscious of getting a message out there about backup and disaster recovery and everything else. This is completely different. This is completely different to anything we've ever seen. The reason being is, it's moved away from spotty teenagers trying to hack into a bank, 20 years ago because they could, or 30 years ago because they could, and they wanted to boast to their friends. This is now a business. I think Sarah mentioned that earlier on. These guys are pretty serious. These are fronted by criminal gangs, and they've got back-end developers. And these back-end developers are just a nasty piece of work. You can go to websites today, Satan.com, if you want to try it and you don't like one of your employees or friends or something like that. And you can just, with no IT experience, you can start a ransomware attack on a business just with their email address. So, and they will give you a portion of the actual ransom that they actually obtain from the business. Our competitors often say to us, you know, the thing that's going to protect us from this is our backups. And being a data protection vendor, I can tell you that's a very risky thing to say, because there are strains of ransomware out there today that are actually sitting there in your backups unbeknownst to you. They are actively attacking and looking for specific file extensions to inject into, so that they ultimately know that when you actually activate your backup, because if you're trying to restore a backup, you've ultimately got somebody, and if you can't restore, then it's a problem ultimately. And people like Garmin in the US had this problem where they actually started to recover their backups, and they basically infected the whole network. And they knew that once they opened that backup, that actually they had them, because the fact that the backup had actually spread the virus meant that they actually had no data to rely on. So they knew they were in a very strong bargaining position. Garmin were also a very easy target because they were regulated by the FDA around their satellite navigation systems for the air products that they actually developed, or the devices on the airplanes. And they had 2 weeks in order to actually get their updated map software onto all the devices. And of course, they were going to miss that deadline. They actually paid the ransom in the end. People say, you know, rely on your backups, but ultimately, you know, the one time when you do actually rely on your backups, you will actually ultimately, you may end up regretting it. But there is hope out there. Don't worry. But there are other challenges in the industry at the moment. I use this slide for when I'm speaking to Claire and people like Claire, because there's so many challenges out there for end users and service providers and distributors alike. Technology has kind of evolved over the last number of years. We've had advent of cloud, we've had increasing data. Stats are that we're going to be 15 times the amount of data we had in 2010 in the next 2 years, 15 times more than what we had in 2010. We've had the advent of the ability to create your own apps, shadow IT, and ultimately this has created a huge amount more risks. Service providers and end users alike have dealt with that by actually adding more software, and ultimately adding more software means more cyber threats, more potential cyber threats. Sarah mentioned earlier the Kaseya one. The Kaseya one was really interesting, or SolarWinds she mentioned as well, but the Kaseya one was very interesting as well, because ultimately not only did they attack Kaseya, but they also attacked Kaseya's service providers as well. So they had a dual way of getting into the actual, in through the Kaseya portals, and they held everybody to ransom, Kaseya and the service provider at the same time. And these are sophisticated attacks that we're seeing all the time. Just some stats for you around disruption. Again, I think you've probably all heard these kind of stats before, but you know, 25% of data breaches were caused by deleting or overwriting files. I mean, it's a pretty standard thing, but 93% of businesses are attacked every year. There used to be every 10 seconds now there's a ransomware attack somewhere happening in the world, right? So it's crazy stats. And the ultimate downtime, or the ultimate cost, is the downtime that we all experience from this. So prevention is better than cure. So we have a way of looking at data in Acronis. We call it SAPAS. These are all the threats and the way to prevent these kind of threats happening to your business. We break it down into 5: safety, accessibility, privacy, authenticity, and security. And safety is effectively your backup, right? So it's having access to your backup, or it's having a backup, but also having it in multiple locations, on-site, in the cloud, for different forms of media, and being prepared for that ultimately. Accessibility is getting access to that backup or data. And accessibility has evolved as well over the years, even since I've been at Acronis. Accessibility is not about getting all your data back, it's about getting the relevant data back. Privacy we all know about, but authenticity is one I particularly love. You know, how can you prove that the data you're actually looking at now is your own? And there are sophisticated blockchain techniques out there that we have as part of our platform that actually can prove that that data hasn't been manipulated. Why is that important? I'll tell you a story, football story, for the football fans out there. there was a player moving between Feyenoord and Inter Milan many years ago, and there was two tranches to the fee. I think it was about 7.5 million or something like that. And I think they paid the first tranche of 4.5 million. And then 6 months later, it was all over the news, 6 months later, they were expected to pay the remaining 3.5 million. Somebody basically faked an Inter Milan invoice and basically changed the actual bank account details on the Inter Milan invoice and sent it through to the actual Feyenoord, or the other way around. I can't remember which way it was. But ultimately, they paid the 3.5 million to the actual people who sent the invoice. They had no way of verifying that it had come from Inter Milan. If they'd used some sort of authenticity kind of tool, they would have been able to verify that invoice was not actually originated with Inter Milan. And security, we just talked about that as well from a ransomware perspective and the actual impact there. I'm going to move through quickly because I know we're running out of time a little bit, but obviously we all know about the NIS framework, the importance of the NIS framework, identifying the actual assets that we have, access control to those assets. These are really fundamental things that we can all use in order to protect us from these threats that we have today. Our platform, and again, I'll move through this quite quickly, is basically, I don't want to be too salesy with you guys, but there's a lot of free stuff on here, and you should be using it. We protect, our platform is a combination of cybersecurity, backup, disaster recovery, automation, and management, but ultimately, it's a single platform, provides all of those solutions integrated into one platform. I said earlier on that other vendors are really important in that as well. And integrating those vendors is part of we're going to integrate 160 vendors this year so that you use the software that you want. I'm not trying to sell you a Cronus. If you like Sentinel-1, use Sentinel-1, but use it with our portal because there's a lot of benefits to using our portal. But ultimately, we offer different levels of packages. I know you probably can't see this, but there's base security. This is all free. So CyberFit scoring, which is like your Cyber Essentials Plus, it measures your organization and how secure you are and what you need to do in order to get your Cyber Essentials or CyberFit scoring up. Vulnerability assessments for your workstations or servers. Is all your patching up to date? Is your operating system up to date? Free AV, right? So use the AV that we actually provide you with in order to protect all your workloads. And then you can move into advanced security if you want, DLP and endpoint EDR and XDR and everything else of that as well. Disaster recovery is my favorite one because I came from a disaster recovery background. This is push-button disaster recovery. You simply prepare the actual recovery server, compute storage, and memory, and then basically select the backup on which you want to actually recover from, and ultimately recover the actual server in the cloud from that backup. So you prepare it using the recovery server, and then you just push the button. When the time comes that you want to recover, it will automatically recover from the actual most recent retention point. Advanced disaster recovery allows you to do production and test failovers. And why are they important? Well, ultimately, you can set up to do a test failover every single day, and it will automatically send you a screenshot. It will ping the actual recovered server in the cloud as well. It will send you a screenshot of that recovered server. It's from a compliance point of view. You can go to your auditors and say, every single day we test our disaster recovery. When I used to do disaster recovery 20 years ago, it was a 2-week exercise, and you didn't recover everything. You just recovered some of the critical systems. So this is now push-button efficiency for every organization to prove to their auditors that they're actually compliant. Backup, you'd expect to be in there being a data protection company. I won't go into the details on that one. Base management allows you to have management of workloads, remote desktop to those workloads if you need it, but ultimately patch management, what I think is what I wanted to talk about most today is, making sure all your patching, I think Francis mentioned it there as well, making sure all your patching's up to date, and making sure that, your hardware health is very good, which this all does for you as well. And automation as well. But again, I'll skip through this one because we're running out of time. Ultimately, it's a single platform on which you can integrate all your favorite vendors. If it's not there, I'm pretty sure we'll be working on it to manage your whole entire estate. Okay, and again, just it's disaster recovery for any server workload. We call this the any slide because we do any recovery, whether it's physical, virtual, any cloud, whether it's Uber cloud, private cloud, any storage. If you want to put it on use storage in Scotland on a NAS device, or you want to use a cloud, your own data center, it doesn't matter. Any storage, any recovery, any workload, anywhere. So technology has ultimately developed over the last number of years. Am I running out of time, by the way? You got 5 minutes? Or? Okay. I won't do my other little speech then. So technology is helping a lot more these days, and we have moved on, as I said, over the last number of years. Again, the integration, our integration of disaster recovery, cybersecurity, these things, years ago we would have talked about disaster recovery without cybersecurity. Now these are just the same thing. They've melded into one. And ultimately, our integration of all those technologies is really helping you. But again, I'm going to repeat it. Vendors need to work better together. And we are working with Microsoft, for example, but we're also working with SentinelOne, CrowdStrike in order to deliver those technologies to you to help you with your management of your estate. So improving RTOs and automating disaster recovery. Anybody who's ever done a cloud disaster recovery rehearsal or test will know that runbooks are very important, and runbooks effectively allow you to actually recover the actual servers in order. Again, they're very sophisticated, but made very simple using some simple block building kind of code. It's very, very straightforward to be able to tell which servers to recover first, which ones are dependent on each other. You can actually ping the actual server once it's recovered. It will automate, and it will tell you that it's recovered, and it will automate the failover. So if you've got, for example, a server in your estate, you've got layer 2 connectivity between the two locations. Once that heartbeat goes down, the actual one will automatically boot up in the actual cloud as well. So Runbooks automates all of this for you, making it a lot easier. If you recover your AD first before your exchange, for example, it's very straightforward. Again, we talk about rehearsals every year. In Acronis, we talk about at least doing a rehearsal once a month, but we encourage you, it's free of charge. Do it every night if you want to, and recover your entire estate every night, and use Runbooks to ultimately automate all of that for you as well. RPO, if you remember from my previous slide, RPO, recovery point objective. If you know, for example, that your RPO for a particular server can't go more than 5 or 6 hours, you can set up alerts on that. And again, there's an RPO management tool which will say to you how long you should actually be, if you want to recover it in a certain amount of time, how long your retention period should be as well. I talked briefly about automated test failover, really, really important. We've scripted this. I was at a large FTSE 250 company recently, and they were with their auditors, and we basically showed them the ability to actually boot up the server to credentials page. They then said, well, how do we know it's running? So we had to write a script to actually automate the login, and then basically show them that the actual server had recovered all the applications as well. So the auditors were happy, but from a compliance point of view, this is fantastic. This is stuff we only dreamed about when I was working in disaster recovery many, many years ago. Network support, really important. I don't need to tell you in this day and age that having multiple locations around the country is challenging, particularly like the pandemic. We give you the ability to do site-to-site VPN built in, point-to-site VPN, but also IPsec tunnels if you need it as well. And again, just a bit of repetition there, but effectively IPsec tunnels are for multiple site recovery. And if you need to manage your DNS configuration, so for example, you don't want to change all your web filtering or anything like that, again, all managed by this solution in the cloud. Same with DHCP. For those of you that use encrypted backups as well, and again, automating all the encrypted backup recoveries, there's a tool there which allows you to actually enter in your credentials for the encrypted backups so that when you're actually automating your disaster recovery, it automatically recovers everything, not waiting for the encryption logs to be actually filled in. This one I particularly like. 2 slides left, Claire, so I'll be finished now. This one I particularly like. This is a failover to a malware-free recovery point. I don't know if anybody's ever experienced this, but when you open a file or a backup and then discover there's malware in there,
We do forensic backups in the background so that before you recover it, you get a little notification to say it's been infected. And you can actually uninfect the file there and then if you wish to. So in the background, it will automatically check every single backup that you've actually created and make sure there's no malware included in those backups. We talk a lot about disaster recovery. We don't talk a lot about failback. And final slide is on the failback, where we automate the failback for you so that it starts to do that in the background. So when you're recovering and you've recovered in site A and you want to recover back to your original location that had the disaster, it will do that in the background, and it will continue to use your recovery site. And then in the background, it will say, how long do you need? I need 1.5 hours to be offline to complete the recovery of the server. When do you want to schedule that? And you can schedule it at your own convenience. So really, really important tools to help you be disaster recovery ready. Hopefully that was of some use to you guys. I'm sorry it was long, but thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.